darkness between sanity and madness.
The complete history of haunted asylums that will haunt you. In the darkness between sanity and madness, there exist places where the boundary dissolved long ago, where human suffering carved itself so deeply into stone and steel that it never truly ended. Tonight, you will walk the corridors where screams still echo, where the living became indistinguishable from the dead, and where the very concept of healing was twisted into something far more sinister. Segment 1. The Danvers State Hospital, where lobotomies carved souls from skulls. You need to understand something before we begin this descent. The human brain, that 3-pound universe of consciousness, can be destroyed with nothing more than an ice pick and a hammer at Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. This wasn't a metaphor, it was Tuesday afternoon procedure. Built in 1878 on a Thornhill, where Judge John Hathorne once condemned women to burn as witches. Danvers was designed according to the Kirkbride plan, Victorian delusion that architecture alone could cure madness. The building stretched like a massive bat across the hilltop, its Gothic towers and endless wings, creating a structure so vast that staff would get lost for hours in its labyrinthine corridors. But you need to focus on what happened inside those walls, because the architecture was never the horror, it was what humans did to other humans in the name of medicine. Dr. Walter Freeman arrived at Danvers in the 1940s, carrying with him an instrument that would make him famous: the transorbital lobotomy pick. Picture this tool for a moment. Imagine an ice pick, sharpened to surgical precision, designed to be hammered through the thin bone above your eye socket, then twisted and scraped through the prefrontal cortex of your brain. Freeman believed he could cure mental illness by severing the connections that made you. The procedure room at Danvers was painted hospital green, that particular shade that's supposed to be calming, but instead feels like the color of decay. Patients would be brought in, often against their will, strapped to 2 tables that had been scrubbed clean of blood from previous procedures. Freeman would position the pick above their eye, raise a small hammer, and with clinical precision, drive the metal spike through bone and into brain tissue. The sound witnesses described it as a wet crack, like breaking kindling in a rainstorm. But here's what the medical journals didn't document. Freeman would sometimes let medical students practice the procedure on patients who were still conscious. The screaming would echo through the hospital's ventilation system, carrying the sound of minds being carved apart to every corner of the building. Nurses reported that after particularly brutal sessions, the hospital's steam radiators would make sounds like whimpering as if the building itself had absorbed the suffering. Howard Daly was 10 years old when his stepmother convinced doctors he needed a lobotomy. 10 years old. He would later describe the sensation of the pick entering his brain as like having your soul scraped out with a spoon. But Howard was one of the lucky ones. He survived with most of his personality intact. Thousands of others weren't so fortunate. The hospital records, what remains of them, document over 2,400 lobotomies performed at Danvers between 1940 and 1960. But the unofficial count, whispered among former staff members, reaches closer to 4,000. These weren't healing procedures. They were systematic destructions of human consciousness, performed in the name of science on people whose only crime was being inconvenient to their families or society. Marie Kennedy, patient admitted for hysteria. What we now know was likely postpartum depression, received a lobotomy in 1951. Her family was told she would be calmer afterward. The procedure left her unable to recognize her own children, incapable of forming new memories, and prone to violent seizures. She spent the next 30 years in Danvers, forgotten by her family, existing in a perpetual present tense, where every moment was both new and terrifying. The most chilling aspect of Danvers wasn't the procedures themselves, it was the meticulous work. Freeman and his colleagues documented everything with the enthusiasm of collectors. Photographs of patients before and after lobotomies, detailed descriptions of behavioral changes, even audio recordings of patients attempting to speak after having portions of their brains destroyed. These archives still exist, locked away in medical libraries, testament to humanity's capacity for clinical cruelty. But the building itself began to change. Staff members reported that certain corridors would suddenly feel 20 degrees colder. Even in summer, the elevator would stop at floors that had been sealed off for years, its doors opening to reveal empty hallways that echoed with sounds that had no source. Night shift nurses learned to avoid the lobotomy wing entirely. After too many encounters with figures in hospital gowns who would disappear when approached. In 1985, a demolition crew working to tear down sections of Danvers made a discovery that wasn't reported in any newspaper. Behind a false wall in the basement, they found a room filled with hundreds of human brains, preserved in formaldehyde, each jar labeled with the patient's name and the date of their lobotomy. Freeman had been collecting them, Studington trying to understand what he had destroyed. The brains were quietly cremated, but the crew members who found them reported nightmares for months afterward, dreams of being trapped in glass jars. Conscious, but unable to move or speak. The hospital closed in 1992, but the building remained, growing more decrepit with each passing year. Urban explorers who broke in reported finding patient records scattered throughout the abandoned wards. Photographs of lobotomy procedures still pinned to bulletin boards, and medical equipment rusted but recognizable. They also reported something else. The sound of drilling coming from empty rooms, the echo of hammers striking metal, and voices pleading in languages that seemed to predate human speech. Today, luxury condominiums stand where Danvers State Hospital once loomed. The developers promised to preserve the building's character while creating healing spaces for modern living. But residents have reported peculiarities that real estate agents prefer not to discuss. Electrical devices that turn on by themselves, always tuning to the same frequency, a low, rhythmic sound like metal scraping against bone. Children who live in the complex sometimes speak about the sad doctors who visit their rooms at night, carrying sharp things and asking if they want to feel better. The most disturbing reports come from residents whose condominiums were built directly over the old lobotomy wing. They describe dreams where they're strapped to tables, looking up at figures in white coats who speak in soothing voices about helping them, about making the pain go away. They wake with headaches centered precisely above their eye sockets, and some report brief moments where they can't remember their own names, the children's faces, or why they were afraid. Because that's the true horror of places like Danvers. They don't just disappear when you tear them down and build something pretty on top. The suffering soaks into the very ground, becomes part of the molecular structure of the place. Every lobotomy performed, there was an act of violence so profound it altered the fundamental nature of human consciousness. And violence of that magnitude leaves marks that transcend physical space. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Danvers State Hospital is this. It wasn't an aberration. It was a model. Similar procedures were being performed at hundreds of institutions across the world, often with even less oversight, less documentation, and less pretense of healing. The ice pick that carved through Howard Dully's 10-year-old brain was just one tool in an arsenal of systematic cruelty that redefined the boundaries of human suffering. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this. Somewhere in your city, in your town, there's probably a building that once housed similar procedures. A place where healers became torturers, where the promise of medicine masked the reality of mutilation. And if consciousness truly is more than just electrical impulses and gray matter, if suffering can indeed stain a place so deeply that it becomes permanent, then those places are still there, still waiting, still echoing with the sounds of minds being carved apart with clinical precision. What makes you so certain that the screaming has ever truly stopped? What makes you so certain that the screaming has ever truly stopped?
Step inside if you dare.
Pennhurst State School, the warehouse of broken children. You need to understand what happens to a child's scream when no one comes to help. At Pennhurst State School and Hospital in Spring City, Pennsylvania, that scream becomes something else entirely. It becomes the baseline frequency of an entire building, the fundamental note upon which all other sounds harmonize. And once you've heard it, once it gets inside your head, you'll recognize it everywhere. In the hum of fluorescent lights, in the whistle of wind through broken windows, in the static between radio stations late at night. Pennhurst opened in 1908 as the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic, a name that reveals everything about how society viewed the children who would be warehoused there. The facility was designed to house 500 residents. By the 1960s, over 3,500 human beings were crammed into buildings, never meant to hold them, creating conditions so horrific that even hardened investigators would vomit during their first visits. But let's talk about what happened to the children, specifically. Because childhood trauma doesn't just damage the individual, it warps the very space where it occurs, leaving psychic wounds that fester for decades. Tommy admitted at age 7 for what his records describe as mental deficiency. Likely nothing more than mild autism. Spent 43 years at For 4 decades, he lived in rooms where the windows were painted black to prevent residents from seeing outside, where the only human contact came during feeding times when staff would shove food through slots in metal doors. The day rooms at Pennhurst were exercises in concentrated suffering. Picture a space the size of a gymnasium, filled with over 100 residents who had been stripped naked and left to sit on concrete floors covered in their own waste. The smell foremost describe it as sweet and rotten simultaneously, like fruit decaying in a septic tank. Residents would rock back and forth for hours, their heads cracking against walls with such repetitive force that the plaster developed grooves from the impact. The sound of skull-meeting concrete became so constant that new employees learned to tune it out within days, a psychological adaptation that speaks to humanity's terrifying capacity to normalize suffering. But the physical abuse was just the surface layer of Pennhurst's horror. The real damage was psychological, administered with scientific precision by staff, who had been trained to view residents not as human beings, but as management problems. Children who showed any spark of intelligence or personality were systematically broken down through isolation, sensory deprivation, and procedures that can only be described as psychological torture. Dr. Ignacy Goldberg, Pennhurst's chief psychologist from 1957 to 1968, developed what he called behavioral modification protocols that were later revealed to be elaborate sadistic experiments. Children who displayed undesirable behaviors, which could mean anything from crying to asking questions, were placed in quiet rooms that were actually sensory deprivation chambers. These rooms were painted entirely black, soundproofed, and maintained at temperatures that fluctuated between freezing and sweltering. Children as young as 5 were left in these spaces for days at a time, emerging with 1,000-yard stares and an inability to respond to their own names. The medical records from Pennhurst, when they can be found, thousands were destroyed or lost when the facility closed, reveal experiments that would have been considered war crimes if performed on adults. Children were given massive doses of experimental psychotropic drugs to test their effects on developing brains. Some were subjected to electroshock therapy without anesthesia, not as treatment, but to see how it would affect their cognitive development. Others were used in studies that involved deliberately inducing seizures, trauma responses, and dissociative states. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Pennhurst was the complete severing of family connections. Parents were told that their children would receive expert care, and that visits would be disruptive to the treatment process. In reality, many children were told their families had died or simply stopped loving them. Some residents spent decades believing they were orphans, only to discover during the facility's closure that their families had been trying to contact them for years, their letters intercepted and destroyed by staff. The building itself began to reflect the accumulated trauma of its residents. Maintenance workers reported that certain sections of Pennhurst would develop structural problems that made no engineering. Sense walls that would crack in perfect spirals, floors that would suddenly sag in the center of rooms despite having concrete foundations, and pipes that would burst in patterns that spelled out what looked like words and languages no one recognized. The most disturbing reports came from the children's wards, where the walls would sometimes appear to sweat a reddish substance that laboratory analysis could never identify. Night shift employees learned to avoid certain corridors entirely. The basement tunnels that connected the various buildings were particularly problematic. Staff members would enter one end and emerge from the other with no memory of the journey, sometimes finding themselves in completely different buildings, with hours missing from their shifts. Some reported encounters with residents who had died years earlier, still wearing the gray institutional clothing, still rocking back and forth with that distinctive rhythmic motion that every Pennhurst employee learned to recognize. The abuse at Pennhurst wasn't limited to neglect and medical experimentation. Sexual assault was so common that it was factored into the daily routine. Certain staff members were known predators, and their schedules were arranged to give them access to the most vulnerable residents. Children who tried to report these assaults were labeled as having behavioral problems and subjected to even more severe isolation and punishment. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Trauma created behaviors that were used to justify more trauma. In 1968, a local television reporter named Bill Baldini gained access to Pennhurst, and filmed what he found there. The resulting documentary, Suffer, the Little Children, showed viewers images that seemed impossible in modern America. Naked children tied to beds, residents eating their own waste, staff members dragging unconscious patients across concrete floors. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming, but Pennhurst remained open for another 19 years. 19 years of additional suffering, additional children fed into a system that had been exposed as fundamentally abusive. The closure process itself was traumatic for residents who had known no other life. Many had been at Pennhurst for decades, their entire adult lives shaped by institutional routine and systematic dehumanization. Some residents, when told they were being moved to group homes, beheaded to stay terrified of a world they couldn't remember or had never known. The staff responsible for transitioning residents reported that many would sit in their new homes staring at walls, still rocking with that distinctive Pennhurst rhythm, still responding to commands that were no longer being given. Today, Pennhurst stands partially abandoned, partially converted into a commercial haunted development that would be darkly comic if it weren't so perfectly representative of how society processes its own guilt. Visitors pay money to be frightened by actors pretending to be the ghosts of residents whose real suffering was far more terrifying than any Halloween performance could replicate. But the real hauntings at Pennhurst aren't the staged scares for tourists. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators report finding patient records still scattered throughout abandoned buildings, photographs of residents taped to walls, and medical equipment that appears to have been used recently, despite the buildings being officially empty for decades. They describe encountering figures in hospital gowns who don't respond to questions, the sound of children crying that seems to come from the walls themselves, and rooms where the temperature drops so suddenly that breath becomes visible in seconds. The most disturbing reports come from the building's basement levels, where the most severe behavioral modification procedures were performed. Visitors describe finding themselves suddenly overwhelmed with emotions that aren't their own waves of despair, terror, and helplessness, so intense they cause physical symptoms. Some report experiencing brief moments where they can't remember their own names, where they feel like children again, lost and afraid, and certain that no one is coming to help, because that's what Pennhurst represents in its purest form. The systematic destruction of hope in developing minds. Every child who entered those buildings, believing that adults were there to help them, had that belief surgically removed through repetitive trauma and abandonment. And when you destroy hope in a child's mind, when you convince them that suffering is the natural state of existence, you create something that transcends individual psychology. Create a kind of psychic wound that infects the very space where it occurred. The records show that over 10,000 individuals lived and died at Pennhurst during its 80-year operation. But that number doesn't capture the full scope of the damage. Each of those residents had families who were told their loved ones were beyond help. Communities that learned to look away from suffering when it became inconvenient to acknowledge. The trauma radiated outward like ripples in a pond, creating a culture of willful blindness that allowed places like Pennhurst to operate in plain sight. And here's what should keep you awake tonight. Pennhurst wasn't unique. Willowbrook in New York, Partlow in Alabama, Fernald in Massachusetts as essence of similar institutions operated simultaneously across the country, each one a laboratory for studying the precise methods by which human dignity could be systematically erased. The children who survived these places grew up to be adults who had learned that authority figures were sources of pain, that seeking help led to punishment, that their own thoughts and feelings were inherently wrong. So when you hear about the good old days, when society knew how to deal with difficult children, remember what that actually meant. Remember the children who spent decades tied to beds, who were told their families had stopped loving them, who learned to stop screaming because no one ever came. Remember that the buildings where this happened are still there, still standing, still echoing with the sounds of childhood being systematically destroyed in the name of social order. And ask yourself this: if consciousness truly persists, if suffering this profound can stain a place permanently, then what happens when thousands of children spend their entire lives learning that pain is the only reliable constant in existence? What kind of psychic residue does that leave behind? And how do you ever truly clean it away? The answer, of course, is that you don't. You just paint over it, build something else on top, and hope that the screaming stays buried deep enough that only sensitive children can hear it in their dreams. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Where were fed to architecture. You need to understand what happens when human suffering is built into the very design of a building, when architecture itself becomes a weapon of psychological destruction. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, was constructed according to the linear plan, a layout specifically engineered to maximize isolation, control, and the systematic erosion of individual identity. But what the architects didn't anticipate was how a building designed to break minds would eventually develop a consciousness of its own, fed by decades of accumulated anguish until it became something hungry, something that learned to sustain itself on human despair. Construction began in 1858, and the building that emerged was a monument to Victorian delusions about the nature of madness. At 666 feet long, a number that seems almost too perfect to be coincidental. Asylum was the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America at the time of its completion. The designers believed that beauty could cure insanity, so they created soaring ceilings, elaborate stonework, and windows that should have filled the spaces with healing light. Instead, they built a machine for destroying human consciousness, one that would operate with ruthless efficiency for over a century. The asylum was designed to house 250 patients in humane conditions. By the 1950s, over 2,400 people were crammed into spaces never meant to hold them, creating a density of human misery that fundamentally altered the building's psychological atmosphere. But the overcrowding was just the catalyst. The real horror began with the treatments that were pioneered. Within those stone walls, procedures that revealed the terrifying creativity humans display when given absolute power over other humans. Dr. Walter Freeman made regular visits to Trans-Allegheny, but he wasn't the only practitioner exploring the frontier of medical torture. Dr. Robert Heath developed a procedure called deep brain stimulation that involved implanting electrodes directly into patients' brains and then applying electrical current to see what would happen. Patients would be strapped to tables while doctors activated different regions of their brains like technicians testing a complex machine. The screaming during these procedures was so intense that the asylum installed additional soundproofing in the medical wings, not for the patient's comfort, but because the noise was disturbing staff in other parts of the building. But let's focus on what made Trans-Allegheny unique. The building's response to the suffering it contained. Maintenance records from the 1940s onward document structural anomalies that engineers couldn't explain. Walls would develop cracks that followed no stress pattern, creating shapes that resembled faces when viewed from certain angles. The building's heating system would malfunction in ways that seemed almost intentional. Certain rooms would become furnace hot, while others dropped to near-freezing temperatures, regardless of the season or the position of the controls. The most documented case involves a patient named Lily Wilkinson, admitted in 1942 for what her records describe as female hysteria, likely postpartum depression following the death of her infant son. Lily was subjected to a new experimental procedure called insulin shock therapy, where massive doses of insulin would be injected to induce comas that could last for weeks. The theory was that the brain would somehow reset during these artificial comas, emerging cleaner and more rational. Lily's treatments took place in a room 666 on the building's top floor, a location chosen for its isolation rather than any supernatural significance. Though staff members would later claim the room number felt like a prophecy. During her 10th induced coma, something went wrong. Her body remained unconscious, but witnesses reported that she would speak in her sleep, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there, describing places that didn't exist. More disturbing were the times when multiple patients throughout the building would suddenly begin speaking Lily's words in perfect unison, their voices creating an echo of her unconscious monologue that would ripple through the asylum's corridors. When Lily finally emerged from the coma after 6 weeks, she was fundamentally changed. She no longer responded to her own name, showed no recognition of family members, and seemed to exist in a state of perpetual terror. But the most unsettling change was her relationship with the building itself. She would walk the hallways with perfect confidence, navigating passages that had been sealed off for years, finding her way to rooms that weren't on any official floor plan. Staff members following her would become lost in corridors they had walked for years, finding themselves in sections of the building they had never seen before. Lily lived at Trans-Allegheny for 43 years, becoming something like a permanent fixture of the asylum. Other patients would seek her out, claiming she could tell them things about their own pasts that she had no way of knowing. She would whisper to them about their families, their childhoods, their secret fears, information that wasn't in any medical file. More disturbing were her predictions about staff members. She would approach nurses and doctors and quietly inform them about accidents that would befall them, illnesses they would develop, or personal tragedies that were coming. Her accuracy rate was unnervingly high. The building seemed to respond to Lily's presence in ways that violated basic physics. Electronics would malfunction when she entered a room, but not randomly. Lights would dim in sequences that seemed intentional, like the building was communicating through electrical impulses. The asylum's pneumatic tube system, used for sending messages between floors, would sometimes deliver notes written in Lily's handwriting to staff members, even when she was confirmed to be asleep in her room. The messages were never threatening, but they contained personal information about the recipients that she had no way of accessing. In 1963, a new night nurse named Margaret Chun documented what became known as the Lily phenomenon in her personal journal. Chun had been assigned to the overnight shift in Lily's ward and quickly noticed that the building's behavior changed dramatically after sunset. Doors that had been locked would be found open in the morning, but only doors that created new pathways to Lily's room. Patients who had been catatonic for years would suddenly become animated, walking in single file toward wherever Lily was sleeping, standing around her bed in silent vigils that would last until dawn. Chun's journal entries, discovered decades later during the asylum's closure, described nights when she would follow these processions of patients and find herself in parts of the building that weren't on any architectural plan. Rooms that were larger on the inside than their exterior walls should have allowed. Corridors that seemed to extend infinitely in both directions, and stairwells that led to floors that didn't exist when viewed from outside the building. Most unsettling were the rooms filled with what appeared to be medical equipment from different eras, some pieces dating back to the asylum's earliest days, others that looked decades ahead of 1960s technology. The most disturbing entry in Chun's journal describes a night when she followed a procession of patients down a stairwell that led to what should have been the building's foundation. Instead, she found herself in a vast underground chamber filled with hundreds of beds, each one occupied by a figure that looked exactly like Lily at different ages. Some appeared to be children, others elderly, but all had Lily's distinctive facial features and the same expression of perpetual terror. The figures were breathing, occasionally shifting position, but none responded to Chun's presence. She fled back up the stairwell and found herself in the main lobby, with no memory of how she had gotten there. Chun tried to report these experiences to the asylum's administration, but her supervisor's responses were strange and inconsistent. Sometimes they would act as if they had no idea what she was talking about. Other times they would nod knowingly and tell her that the building takes some getting used to. When she pressed for explanations, she was transferred to day shifts and eventually encouraged to find employment elsewhere. Lily died in 1985, found in her bed on a Tuesday morning with no obvious cause of death. The autopsy revealed that her brain tissue showed patterns of electrical activity that shouldn't have been possible in a deceased person, neurons firing in complex sequences that continued for hours after clinical death. More disturbing was the discovery that portions of her brain showed architectural formations that resembled the asylum's layout, as if the building's floor plan had somehow grown into her neural pathways. The night after Lily's death, every electronic device in the asylum malfunctioned simultaneously. Phones would ring, but no one would be on the line. Radios would tune themselves to frequencies that broadcast sounds like whispered conversations in languages no one recognized, and the building's intercom system began playing what sounded like recordings of patient sessions from decades earlier. The phenomena lasted exactly 43 hours, 1 hour for each year Lily had lived in the asylum. Trans-Allegheny closed in 1994. But the building's story was far from over. Urban explorers breaking into the abandoned facility reported finding patient records that appeared to have been updated years after the asylum's closure, medical equipment that showed signs of recent use, and sections of the building that seemed to have been renovated by unknown parties. Most unsettling were reports of encounters with a figure who matched Lily's description, still walking the corridors, still navigating passages that led to rooms that shouldn't exist. Professional paranormal investigators have documented temperature fluctuations in the asylum that follow patterns matching human brainwave frequencies, electromagnetic readings that seem to pulse in rhythm with a human heartbeat, and audio recordings that capture what sound like thousands of voices whispering in perfect unison. The most comprehensive study, conducted by a team from West Virginia University in 2003, concluded that the building exhibits environmental anomalies consistent with a large-scale psychokinetic phenomenon. But stopped short of explaining what that actually meant. The asylum now operates as a tourist attraction, offering ghost tours and overnight stays for visitors seeking supernatural thrills. But the commercialization has created an unexpected problem. Some tourists report leaving the asylum with memories that aren't their own. They describe vivid dreams about medical procedures they never experienced, phantom pains in body parts that were never injured, and an inexplicable knowledge about the asylum's history that goes far beyond what any tour guide provided. More disturbing are the reports of visitors who claim to have encountered Lily during their tours. These encounters follow a consistent pattern. A woman matching her description approaches them in one of the asylum's many corridors, makes eye contact, and whispers something that the visitors can never quite remember afterward. But in the days and weeks following their visit, these individuals report changes in their own behavior and perception. They find themselves knowing things about their friends and family that they were never told, predicting events with unsettling accuracy, and experiencing moments where they feel like they're seeing the world through someone else's eyes. The most recent development involves children who visit the asylum. Several families have reported that their children, after touring the facility, begin displaying knowledge about medical procedures that they should have no way of knowing. These children draw pictures of surgical equipment, describe historical events from the asylum's past in disturbing detail, and sometimes speak about the lady in the white dress who shows them things they're not supposed to see, because that's the true horror of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It represents the possibility that consciousness isn't as individual as we believe, that extreme suffering can create psychic imprints so powerful they become self. Billy Wilkinson spent over 4 decades having her mind systematically dismantled and rebuilt by experimental procedures, until the boundary between her consciousness and the building that contained her began to dissolve. The asylum became an extension of her damaged psyche, and she became a permanent resident of its psychic architecture. And if that's true, if places can absorb and retain human consciousness, if buildings can become repositories for accumulated trauma and pain, then Trans-Allegheny represents something far more terrifying than a haunted house. It represents the possibility that our suffering doesn't end when we die, that the places where we experience our deepest pain become eternal prisons for fragments of our consciousness. So when you walk through old buildings, when you feel that inexplicable chill in certain rooms, when you sense a presence that has no physical form, consider this: you might be encountering the psychic residue of someone whose mind was so thoroughly shattered that pieces of it are still scattered throughout the physical space where the shattering occurred. And ask yourself if Lily Wilkinson's consciousness could merge with the architecture of Trans-Allegheny, if her suffering could become the building's baseline reality. Then what happens to your own mind when you enter that space? What fragments of your own consciousness might you leave behind? And what alien thoughts might you carry away with you into the world beyond those stone walls? The answer, like so many aspects of Trans-Allegheny's horror, is still being written in the neural pathways of everyone who dares to step inside.